The Mediterranean Sea, ancient, storied, and once again the stage for something the world has not seen in years. It is before dawn when the first satellite images begin to circulate among military intelligence desks from Washington to Tel Aviv. Something is moving, something enormous. On radar screens and thermal imaging feeds, the silhouette is unmistakable. A carrier strike group cutting westward through the Strait of Gibraltar, its escorts fanned out like a clenched fist preparing to strike. Within hours, the images are on the desks of senior military analysts across 4 continents. Phones ring, emergency briefings are called, and somewhere in Tehran, inside the heavily guarded halls of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, officers lean over a table studying the same information, and they do not like what they see. The balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean has just shifted, and Iran did not see it coming. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what the region has become over the past several years. The Middle East has been quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, sliding toward a broader confrontation. Iran, emboldened by proxy networks stretching from Yemen to Lebanon, has extended its military reach far beyond its own borders. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi movement in Yemen, armed factions in Iraq and Syria, all of them supplied, trained, and directed with varying degrees of Iranian involvement. Meanwhile, Israel has been conducting a sustained shadow war against Iranian-linked forces across Syria, striking weapons convoys and military infrastructure with near-weekly precision. The United States has maintained carrier strike groups in the broader region, a visible and deliberate message of deterrence. But deterrence, like any message, must be sent repeatedly to be heard. Then came the escalation. Iranian-backed drone and missile attacks began striking targets across the region with increasing frequency and boldness. American bases were targeted. Commercial shipping in the Red Sea came under assault from Houthi forces, armed with Iranian-supplied munitions. The entire arc of the Middle East began to feel like a fuse being slowly and deliberately lit. Europe watched with growing alarm, particularly as energy markets trembled and shipping insurance costs spiked to levels not seen in decades. Then came the moment that changed the calculus entirely. Intelligence networks tracked the movement of a major Western naval force as it entered the Mediterranean, a deployment of extraordinary scale and symbolic weight. The French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, one of the most powerful non-American carriers ever built, led the formation. Flanked by frigates, destroyers, a nuclear-powered attack submarine running silent beneath the surface, and support vessels stretching across the horizon, the strike group moved with purpose and precision into the eastern Mediterranean. This was not a routine patrol. The timing was deliberate. The route was deliberate. Every element of the deployment was designed to send a message that could be read from space, because it was being watched from space, by adversaries and allies alike. The Charles de Gaulle carries a full complement of Rafale M fighter jets, aircraft capable of deep strike missions against hardened targets across the entire region. Combined with naval cruise missiles and an integrated air defense umbrella that could cover hundreds of miles of contested airspace, this carrier group represented a credible and immediate offensive capability. France coordinated closely with NATO partners and American Naval Command in the region. The deployment was designed not merely as a show of force, but as a statement of collective resolve, that the West was not prepared to allow the Eastern Mediterranean to become a contested space dominated by Iranian proxy pressure or the threat of escalatory attacks. Iran's response was swift and in many ways predictable, but its intensity surprised even those who had been watching Tehran closely. Within days of the carrier group's arrival in theater, Iranian-backed forces launched a coordinated barrage of ballistic and cruise missiles from positions in Yemen and from proxy sites along the Lebanese border. The stated targets were Israeli military infrastructure and American logistics hubs in the region. But the timing left little doubt that the launches were also a direct message to the Western naval force now anchored in Iran's strategic backyard. NATO's integrated air defense network was ready. American Aegis destroyers, Israeli Arrow and David Sling interceptors, and French SAMP/T batteries activated simultaneously, creating an overlapping dome of missile defense that reached from the surface of the Mediterranean to the edge of the upper atmosphere. The intercept rate was high, not perfect, but high enough to blunt the attack and deny Iran the psychological victory it was seeking. Iranian commanders then shifted tactics. Swarms of explosive-laden drones, cheap, numerous, and difficult to intercept en masse, were launched in waves designed to overwhelm and exhaust air defense ammunition. This approach had been refined in the attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure and in the strikes against Israel months earlier. But the density of the Western naval presence meant that response options were plentiful, and electronic warfare systems aboard the carrier group began disrupting drone guidance signals before they could close on their targets. Within 72 hours of the initial Iranian response, the Mediterranean had transformed from a troubled but manageable theater into the most militarily concentrated body of water on the planet. American carrier groups already operating in the broader region repositioned to reinforce the French deployment. British Royal Navy destroyers moved toward the eastern basin. Italian and Greek warships joined the formation under NATO command structures, extending the defensive perimeter and multiplying the force's reach. Air patrols intensified. NATO AWACS surveillance aircraft flew continuous loops over the eastern Mediterranean, feeding real-time intelligence to the carrier strike groups below. Submarines, American, French, British, slid beneath the surface to unknown positions, a reminder to every adversary that the sea itself had teeth that could not be seen. Intelligence agencies in Washington and London began issuing quiet but urgent internal assessments. The conflict had reached a threshold where miscalculation by any single actor could produce consequences that could not be contained. The word that kept appearing in classified briefings was the same word diplomats were working furiously to avoid: escalation. The Mediterranean is not merely a body of water. It is the geographic spine connecting 3 continents. It carries the shipping lanes that supply Europe with energy and manufactured goods, the undersea cables that carry the digital communications of a dozen nations, and the military corridors through which any major Western intervention in the Middle East must pass. Whoever controls the Eastern Mediterranean controls the choke points, and choke points are where wars are won before they are fought. Aircraft carriers in this context are more than weapons platforms. They are floating political statements. A carrier group's presence in contested waters signals a commitment that no diplomatic communique can replicate, because a carrier group can strike, sustain operations, and project air power over an area the size of a small country, without needing permission from any host nation. Iran understands this. The IRGC has run war game scenarios involving carrier groups for years, knowing that these formations represent the deepest expression of Western military power projection capability. What Iran may not have fully accounted for is the convergence. The fact that multiple Western powers, operating under a shared strategic umbrella, could deploy coordinated multi-domain force at scale and speed. Submarines deny the seas. Carriers deny the sky. Missile defense denies the missile threat. This is layered deterrence operating simultaneously across every dimension of modern warfare. The world was not watching in silence. Energy markets responded within hours of the first confirmed reports of the naval deployment. Crude oil futures spiked as traders calculated the risk premium of a broader conflict threatening shipping routes through the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz. Insurance underwriters began raising premiums on vessels transiting the Red Sea to levels that made some shipping companies reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and millions to their logistics chains. In Europe, governments that had been carefully managing their exposure to Middle Eastern tensions suddenly found themselves pulled toward harder positions. Germany, France, and the United Kingdom issued coordinated statements of support for defensive operations, while privately working through diplomatic backchannels to prevent the crisis from crossing the threshold into open war. China, which had been expanding its economic relationships with both Iran and Gulf states, watched with visible unease as one of its primary oil supply corridors came under threat. Russia, already stretched by its own military commitments, issued warnings about Western escalation, while simultaneously gauging the implications for its own geopolitical positioning in Syria.